It is my absolute honor today to introduce our first keynote speaker for today, Lord David Willetts. He's the president of Resolution Foundation and has served as a member of the Parliament for Havan from 1992 to 2015. And he has also been the Minister of Universities and Science from 2010 to 2014. And he has previously worked at HM Treasury and the Number 10 Policy Unit. He's a visiting professor at the King's College London, a board member of the UK Research and Innovation, a board member of the Surrey Satellites, and of the Biotech Growth Trust. So I welcome him to GapSummit 2022, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be with you today. And it's great to see people once again able to meet at conferences like this. And I think you come from around the world, and that is fantastic. You are very welcome here in the UK, and I hope that you really are making new acquaintances and friendships, because COVID was so tough, particularly for the younger generation, in making the kind of networks that previous generations were able to do. You are all biotech players in some sense or other, researching, entrepreneurs, combining those two things. Every person in this room knows more about biotech than I do. So I'm not going to talk to you about the science. I'm going to try to connect what you research and understand, the fundamentals of biological science, with where I've made my career in politics and public policy. And a problem that has preoccupied me increasingly, and which I wrote a book about a decade ago, is fairness between the generations, the intergenerational contract, as it's sometimes called. And I realized that the fantastic opportunity of speaking to you guys today was a great moment to try to rise to the challenge of putting the social contract that holds a modern society together in some kind of biological, natural framework, not just talking about it in the language of finance and politics. So I'm going to start with calories and research which has been done on calorie consumption and calorie production in primitive societies by anthropologists looking at groups in the South American rainforest and in parts of Africa. And what they track is, first of all, calorie consumption. And of course, we know from the very first moment you are born, you are a consumer of calories, but you're not producing many for your family or tribe or clan. You are a net consumer of calories produced by others. Through your teens, you start becoming a calorie producer yourself as well as a consumer. But because by and large humans have quite a sophisticated diet and have to devote quite a lot of time and effort to working out what can be eaten and what can't be eaten, it takes a surprisingly long time for these youngsters in the most primitive, original tribes to fully become calorie producers themselves, learning which berries you can eat, which ones you don't eat, which parts of the fish you can eat, which parts you can't eat. Then during their adult years, they become net producers of calories. They generate for the tribe many more calories than they are actually consuming. And I'm sure even as we speak, there is some probably woman out gathering berries and herbs, and some other person out catching fish, staggering back to the encampment, thinking, I've caught 5 fish and I'm going to be lucky if I eat 1 myself. I've got a 2 for the kids, and I've got another 1 for my aging parents. So then, later on in life, as your capacity to create and produce calories declines, you become, once again, a net consumer of calories. And if you have a totally stable picture of this as a functioning community operating in a sustainable way. At the end of your life, your calories that you have produced and the calories that you should have consumed should be even. I think that that is quite a good description of the foundations of the social contract. If when we were born, we could immediately feed ourselves, we would not be dependent on others. And at any point, at any one snapshot moment, you may be a net recipient of calories produced by others, or you may be a net producer of calories produced for others. But those exchanges can equally be think of the way in which, as an individual, you smooth out your calorie consumption so it is better distributed across time than your calorie production. So these exchanges at any one moment between generations are also, in effect, how we spread our own consumption along time. So as one economist put it about pensions, what looks at any moment like you're giving funding to an old person can be regarded as you're giving funding to yourself when you are older. Now, that account, which is based on the biological fundamental realities of how humans operate, is, oddly enough, not a bad account of how modern government functions either, although we focus at any one moment on the welfare state as a redistributor from rich to poor. People who are rich are the high-calorie producers, and people who are poor are the calorie consumers from others. You can equally regard a lot of what the welfare state does as essentially redistributing across time. Very heavy public spending on education and child health services, relatively little public service for fit adults, and once again, a large amount of welfare state spending through pensions and healthcare for older people. So before you reach the language of economics and political economy, if you just think in terms of calories, I think you have got the basics pretty clear. Now, let's go back to that tribe and do a thought experiment. And imagine that there's been some couple of years of particularly benign weather. There have been less depredations on the tribe. And for whatever reason, there's been an increase in the birth rate and an increase in the number of kids who survive through childhood. Now, let's just think of that in terms of the patterns of calorie consumption and production. So the first thing that happens is you track these kids through time. The first thing that happens is that the hunting and gathering middle-aged parents have to do more hunting and gathering in order to feed more children's mouths. So the first thing that there is a pressure on the older working population. If they are, and think of a contract where you would hope that each child in this tribe, whenever he or she were born, would be able to consume the same amount of calories during their childhood. So for a time, it makes life tougher. Then this big cohort reaches adulthood. And imagine behind them, the old weather conditions returned, or the predators got back to their business, so that the cohort behind them is smaller again, back to the usual size. So you've got this big cohort who are now all adults. And what do they notice? That suddenly this society feels very prosperous. They're all out hunting and gathering. Calorie production has gone up, but the ratio of calorie producers to calorie consumers has become more favorable. You've got more producers and fewer consumers coming along behind. So you can basically throw a party. If there's some herbs out in the wood, in the forest, that enable you to feel very good after supper, you can bloody well take those herbs, and it won't matter because pressures are less intense. And then that big cohort reaches old age. And they find that the smaller group of workers behind them, the later generation, don't seem to be able to produce the calories that they need quite as effectively as they were able to do when they were all in their prime. So they sit around saying the younger generation, they're just not working as hard as we did. They're not as productive as we were. Here we say, all we're asking is the same amount of calories as our parents had, but they seem to find it hard to do for us. Now, what I try to do in my thinking about the intergenerational contract is apply that picture of the world to modern societies. And if you asked a lay person instinctively the key question, would you like to be born in a small cohort or a big cohort? The obvious answer seems to be it would be better to be in a small cohort. Because if you're in a small cohort, you think, well, you're traveling through life, business class, not economy class. Less competition, less sharp-elbowed competitors in the labour market or the housing market. Must be better to be a small cohort, which was the classic view amongst demographers and political economists. My argument is the opposite, that in a modern market economy and a modern welfare state, it's better to be a big cohort. Your tastes shape the market economy. Your votes shape policies. And when you are in your prime, and for Britain, the large cohort was born after the war between 1945 and 1965, and although it changes its shape a bit, there are many Western countries which had some sort of post-war baby boom. So when you are going through life as a large young cohort, you get Carnaby Street and the surge of youthful excitement. Interesting, you also get more rioting. You get more. You're more discontented. You're more challenging. Then, when you're all working away in your prime with fewer pensioners ahead of you and fewer children behind you, you can cut taxes and lower public expenditure, because these are very favourable economic circumstances, which is basically Britain in the 1980s and 90s. This is the demographic underpinning of Thatcherism. And then as you get older, your demographic pressures push up spending on pensions and push up spending on the health services, and it involves profound pressures to increase public spending, and taxes have to go up, and people are very grumpy about all that. So my view is that these insights from anthropologists, and they're just the very basics of the human condition, help us understand both what is the underlying social contract that holds societies together, and also helps us to understand the disruptive effects of changes in cohort size on countries. And I've presented it through the perspective of an advanced Western country, but there are other ways in which demographics can reshape societies. The famous demographic transition, which has been summarized very crudely as first we stop dying like flies, then we stop breeding like rabbits. And you have that surge in population for a time, when you have a massive increase in the number of young people, not quite the same as the post-war baby booms in prosperous societies. These are developing countries that have a massive sudden increase in the number of young people, which is the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge any modern society faces, what it does with all those young people. If it educates them and finds something useful for them to do, it transforms that society into a modern creative market economy, or indeed like China, it's certainly into a modern economy. If you have got no use for those young people, if you don't educate them sufficiently, if you have clan-based or patriarchal or closed systems in the labour market so that these extra young people can't be found productive work unless they have the right contacts or come from exactly the right place, then you have things like the Arab Spring, massive rebellions driven by large increases in the number of young people that a society cannot absorb. Phenomenon that Iran went through in the 70s, that other parts of North Africa are going through now. And I think that the challenge, the extra challenge today is that there are parts of Africa where, despite the success in improving life expectancy and longevity, birth rates have not fallen by as much as many demographers and development economists expected. And with changes in manufacturing and modern economic models, it's harder to see how they could have large-scale, low-cost manufacturing as the way out and the way up, which was classically through the 20th century what developing countries did faced with this demographic opportunity. So it is a massive challenge. Now, this is where you come in. The only prospect that we have in helping these societies with going through these massive demographic challenges, either in the interesting special case of post-war boomers in Western countries, or the wider challenge of developing countries facing a big increase in their population. The only way we could possibly get through this is paces of innovation and different sorts of innovation on a scale that the world has not seen. It can't be the old-fashioned fossil fuel innovation. It can't be mass manufacturing. It's just possible that there are people here working on ideas and projects for a biological circular economy. I'm involved in co-chairing a fund investing in synthetic biology, which, as they say, will feed us, fuel us, heal us. We were looking at one project the other day where some synthetic biologists had created an algae which produces conventional airplane fuel, but through a biological process. And so a properly circular economy where you take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, you grow the algae, you produce the fuel, you burn the fuel, but at least there's no net increase in carbon dioxide. I did ask them, so how much of this stuff do we need to produce to fuel the world's aeroplanes? And they said, oh, you just need a very large lake in which we can grow all the algae. I said, how big a lake? They said, roughly the size of Portugal. So there's still more work to be done. But who knows how these innovations that you are working on, how exactly they will generate innovative products and services. But when I look at this really quite tough demographic scene, it's what you do that gives me the greatest hope that we may be able to rise to the challenge. Over to you. So feel free to ask questions about that, or indeed anything else on, wider science policy, having worked on it in the past and being involved in it both through my role on UKRI and also as chair of the UK Space Agency. So, yes, person there.
Hi, I'm Danica, PhD student at EMBL Heidelberg. Speaking of the social contract, I was wondering whether you think that there is not enough emphasis on replaceability for young people when they choose their careers. For example, maybe for me and maybe for many of you here, a huge amount of emphasis and promotion and competition was for jobs which would anyway be done if I didn't do them. I don't want to name examples, but I think you can all think of what those might be. But maybe not enough emphasis on jobs which wouldn't be done unless people move into them, such as in biotech entrepreneurship, etc., and things like that. So do you think that there's not enough promotion amongst young people to move into these factors and not thinking enough about the replaceability problem? Because I've read arguments that a huge amount of human effort is wasted on competition to do things which only a few people need to do, and not enough human effort goes towards doing things which are new, public policy, entrepreneurship, etc.
Yeah, that's interesting. Of course, for me, coming from a conservative background, I think there's also something satisfying about doing a role that has been done by many people before you and which you hope will be done by many people after you, for which one example is, as I did, serving as a Member of Parliament. The sense that you are, it's a bit like acting a role in a play where you, to some extent, the script is written for you, right? On the other hand, it's like an actor occupying a role. You can give your interpretation of it. You can try to do it in a distinctive way. And there are quite a few jobs like that, and I don't think we should dismiss them. In terms of going into innovation and biotech, I'm a bit more optimistic than you, because when I think back to my cohort going through university 40 years ago now, look, I did the civil service exam and went into Treasury as a civil servant. Lots of my friends went into the city and did banking. What I notice now, here in Cambridge and more widely, is a number of people many more people do doctorates. We've increased the number of doctorates. And doctorate, of course, it can be a route into an academic career, but equally can be a route into innovative work of exactly what you're describing. In fact, the sort of links between education attainment and entrepreneurship are, once you've accessed higher education, the longer you stay on, the more likely you are to end up creating a business and being an entrepreneur. So I personally think, that is a growing opportunity taken by more people, but others may have a different experience. I'm quite optimistic. So yours is a reasonable challenge, but I'm quite optimistic. There are more people doing more startups than ever before in the UK economy.
It's not to say, by the way, that doing replaceable jobs is not important, but it's just to say whether the emphasis is misaligned. And there should be more focus on doing things which within this job might not be done unless there was a push for it.
Now, question just there in front.
Thank you. My name is Marco, PhD student here in Cambridge in toxicology and neuroscience. The key question is, for me at least, is as leaders of tomorrow, as young people that are ambitious and are here because we want to make an impact on the industry, clearly it seems to me that the government and healthcare investments can play a big role in what the pharmaceutical and biotech industry will be in the future and how health will be accessible to everyone. So the question is, as a foundation, and I think many of us would be wondering what a foundation does, I'm still not very clear about it. So as a foundation, how do you work with governments to do things like increasing healthcare investments, increasing health equity, and what is the track there for people like us to get involved in a foundation like yours?
So Resolution Foundation, we're a think tank. We're based in Westminster. We've got about 20 smart, young researchers. We look at economic policy. We particularly focus on living standards. We particularly focus on the less affluent half of the population. We try to make sense of what's happening at the moment. We focus to some extent on all the short-term issues. How is the tax system working? How is the benefit system working? We did a lot of work with government on designing COVID packages for labour market, labour market is one of our areas of expertise. We've similarly done a lot of work with government on how you could help with the energy price challenge and design of policy instruments. But in the longer run, we're also doing an economic inquiry in partnership with the London School of Economics about kind of the underlying challenge of raising Britain's growth rate, which since the financial crash has been appalling. And we have open recruitment and indeed try to have interns in as well who just get a sort of 3-month glance as to how we work. And we've got a new intern just arrived this week. As to, and on sort of, for you facing your careers, and choosing your careers, there is, there are lots of routes. You don't need to feel obliged to go straight into the startup option. It's also perfectly possible to learn a bit more about the industry by going into an existing player and then setting up on your own or doing so with some friends. And as you know, there are lots of venture capital funds now in the UK. It's not quite as strong as the US West Coast or the US East Coast, but we're probably, the Oxford, Cambridge, London Golden Triangle is probably third in the world after US West Coast, after US East Coast. And I think there are fantastic opportunities there. I'm also I'm involved in these kind of investments in several ways. The Biotech Growth Trust largely operates via a US analyst called OrbiMed, which does these investments. I'm also on the board of a founders company which is focused more on doctoral students with a smart idea, partly because in some universities, and the issue is universities are very greedy for IP, outrageously greedy for IP, which inhibits a lot of people trying to set up their own business. They by and large focus yet less on IP generated by doctoral students. So it's easier to negotiate a good deal with a doctoral student earlier on than people who've joined the full-time academic staff of the university. And there was a little article in the Times on Monday by Jamie McFarlane of the VC fund, which sets this out. So yeah, so I think, to be honest, the hunger for biotech, and if you look at what has happened as a result of COVID crisis, is a fantastic opportunity for you. I know there's been a tech crash since, but I think biotech is pretty robust in the long run. Yes, there.
Hi, good morning, Dr. Willetts. I'm Esther Grandier. I'm doing a double degree between EPFL and NSW. And thank you very much for your speech today. I just was very curious about your time in the Parliament, so I wanted to ask you 2 questions, which are, the first one, when you voted or worked on policies, have you ever seen the impact actually in the society or when you're walking in the street, for example? I was really curious about, do you feel the impact? Do you see that you can make a change or not that much? And the second question is also, how hard is it to bring into Parliament topics that are maybe more discussed or that are more new, let's say, and that could be hard to discuss, so to vote policies for? Thank you.
Well, I'll give you 2 examples. A policy that I was heavily involved in and shaped and was very controversial, but I think it was necessary and fair, was increasing higher education student fees in England from £3,000 to £9,000. And that was controversial. Of course, it's not money for people outside England who are here. It's not like the American system. It's not money the student has to pay up front. There's a repayment arrangement, and it's not like a commercial. It's often described as a pile of debt, but it's not like a credit card debt or a bank debt. It's an obligation to repay at a rate of 9% above a threshold, which is currently £27,000 or so, and is about to be reduced back down to £25,000. So that was certainly, and faced with the public expenditure pressures and the fact that higher education was never going to be a priority for public spending, if I wanted students, undergraduates in England, to have a well-financed higher education, the only way to ensure there was a proper unit of resource behind the students doing the studies was to expect them to pay back afterwards, to run such a loan scheme, but only paying back if they could afford to, and not expecting people in low-paid jobs afterwards to pay back. So that was a big change. I think it actually brought more money into higher education through the years of austerity than in almost any other key service, but it was controversial then. The other example, which is very relevant more relevant really for people here today, and where I had a very interesting exchange with German MPs, was mitochondrial donation, mitochondrial disease, where we've got up in Newcastle some real British expertise in dealing with mitochondrial donation. But to do that, you have to, as you know, it's a kind of disease of the membrane of the cell, and you have to replace the membrane with a donation of mitochondria, which will have a different DNA, which enables the Daily Mail to produce the headline, "Children with 3 parents." And now, the experts tell me that the DNA in the membrane is not what gives you your character or the colour of your eyes, and it's more like, think of it as a different brand of battery being inserted. But nevertheless, that Daily Mail headline was possible and was indeed part of the media coverage. And it was not something the government felt it could whip MPs for. It was a free vote. It was seen as a moral and ethical issue because for some people, their religious beliefs mean this couldn't be done. And so I was At that point, I was on the backbenches, and I was one of the MPs from the backbenches who urged the government to bring the legislation forward and to support mitochondrial donation. And I had a very interesting conversation with a group of German MPs who came to see us and said this would not be possible in Germany because of our history and horrific experiences of attempts to produce so-called perfect people with horrific crimes associated with it. The idea of an intervention like that to change someone's DNA would not be acceptable in German political culture. And again, I understand that. And it's a reminder for scientists that science operates in a particular moral and cultural environment, some of which is historically shaped, and things that may be possible in one country may not be possible in another one. Yes, here. Yes, here comes the microphone. How are we doing for time? Oh, yes, I tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to collect several questions because we're going to run out of time soon.
Hi, so I found your talk really interesting, and one of the things that I've kind of found throughout the summit is that a lot of talk about biotech is particularly focused on, I think, developed Western economies at times,
right.
Just the technology people require, the resources they require. I'm originally from Fiji, where we don't have the transport systems in place to get resources as easily or accessibly as you can in Europe. That's actually part of my attraction coming here. And I was really curious to hear about what you may have, or if there's anything happening in things like UKRI or DFID in terms of encouraging more innovation in less accessible or developing countries, which
Right.
is, of course, naturally harder due to the logistical constraints on those countries.
Very, very fair point. Let's collect several questions because I'm sorry, we are running out of time. Do you want to, there's a group of questioners all here in the middle. I think there's 2 or 3, yeah.
Hi, I'm Juan from Imperial College London. My question would be like, nowadays we are discussing a lot about climate change, diversity, inclusion, etc. But what about 20 years ago? What were the main problems that we tackled 20 years ago? And then following that, are those problems solved?
Yes, and behind you?
Hi, I'm Duncan. I work for the Medical Research Council. I wanted to pick up on your point about was that universities being greedy for IP. So, I mean, there are some economists, like particularly Mariana Mazzucato comes in mind, who talks a lot about how it's actually public funders of research who take the biggest risks in science, and that actually we should have mechanisms to recapture that value. And that VC, by contrast, actually only really bets on bets that have already been very sort of pre-validated. So it's only fair that universities and public institutions can have IP.
Yep. Right. Up there behind you. Yeah. And then we're going to go. Is there a second mic? No, we're going to go. Right. Then we've got to go over the other side. Yep.
Hi. Yeah, my name's Reza, med student and startup founder. So my question was, you mentioned innovation being very important.
Yep.
But as Marco said earlier, it's really dependent on political culture as well.
Yep.
So it's all good trying to innovate in climate change, in agriculture, but if societal change causes economic change, causing political change, government views can change, and then we are then not being able, we can't innovate in agriculture. So the current prime minister now said that wind farms are extremely ugly. And this is something that should have been settled ages ago. So what do we do in that sphere where it's very anti-tech in some sectors?
Right. Yep. Ugly wind farms. Do you want a couple of questions there? Then we go over to the... Oh, there is a second microphone. Fantastic. Let's do a batch over there. Right.
It's more of a societal question. You said you wanted to address sort of fairness between the generations. I'm Miles, by the way, from AstraZeneca. Going back to the analogy you used about calories, and in a larger cohort, you can be more prosperous. You don't have to work as hard, almost. Given that we're now in a smaller cohort, having to support a larger cohort above us, do you think that the older generation needs to be doing more to support younger people? Given we can't buy houses, given we're struggling to heat our homes, and we're getting paid 100 times less than the top executives who are from a good generation.
You should see the article I wrote in the Telegraph about that last week. And then, if you want to be depressed, see all the comments afterwards about it.
Hi, I'm Milena. I'm a science and engineering fast streamer. I work at the Food Standards Agency at the moment. And I'm really passionate about getting more scientists and young people into the civil service and government. And my question is, how do you think we can attract more of the people who are in this room to the civil service, beyond the obvious, pay us more?
Right. Right. Good. And yes, here.
Hi, I'm Max. I'm doing a mole bio PhD in Vienna. I really liked how you talked about demographic opportunity, particularly in emerging economies. And you kind of said how, in terms of sustainability, it's going to be hard for these countries to get out of that pressure with mass production and low-cost manufacturing. What do you think are alternatives for those economies?
Right. Okay, I'm sorry, we are tight for time. Let me just very quickly, there's a set of brilliant points. So we do have an ODA aid program, of which science has been one of the priorities, science partnerships. And it was running at 0.7% of GDP, it's gone down to 0.5, going to go back up to 0.7. And I think Britain has been one of the world leaders in promoting those type of links. But you're right, there is also a real resource cost in terms of physical transport and engagement, though more and more can be done online, including remote surgery and educational programs delivered online. But we have to do, the more we can do this in partnership with developing countries, the better. 20 years ago, the guy who asked about what was the problem 20 years ago, the problem 20 years ago was climate change. And the scandal is that we didn't do enough about it when the problem first emerged. And there are books now being written about how that opportunity was missed. I started my career working in the Treasury and then working in number 10 for Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher gave a speech influenced by Crispin Tickell on, first of all, she focused on the hole in the ozone layer, then on the challenge of climate change. Been around, it's not some new scientifically just recently discovered problem. That's the scandal for my generation. Mariana Mazzucato, and the state should get its return via its general power to tax. I do also think that you can have, and it's one of America's strengths, a strong social contract, that if you've made $1 billion as a result of a research you began at MIT or indeed at Cambridge, you give a few $100 million back to the place that you came from. I do think trying to pin down companies by taking specific equity stakes, I am much so I admire Mariana, I'm less keen on that as a mechanism because I observe its actual effect in impeding innovation. Should we... Oh, the cohort size, yes, I've faced that challenge. Oh, getting involved. There are various programs. We are trying to recruit more scientists into government. Here in Cambridge, there's CSAP, the Centre for Science and Policy, which tries to give scientists a first insight into the world of policy. And I have to say, my friendly advice to scientists, speakers and non-scientists, is that politicians and others are working in a different environment with different constraints. One of the things that's most tricky, and you also get this with the business community, politicians are not incompetent business leaders. Politicians are people doing something different. Politicians are not bad scientists failing to follow the evidence. Politicians are engaged in a different activity for which scientific evidence is relevant, but you've also got to take account of history and cultural context and democratic consent. So a good place to start is mutual respect, including regarding democratic politics as a honourable calling and just a different one from some of the other equally honourable callings. We do want to recruit more scientists. One of the problems is that the civil service is also structured around promoting people and boosting your income by moving on and moving up. There's a strong culture of moving people around. Something I'm very aware of just having become chair of the UK Space Agency is we have working for us some people who just are experts on Earth observation and want to stay working on Earth observation, but with hopefully some increases in their income rather than being told, have you thought of becoming an expert on tax credits instead and then we can pay you a bit more? And that is a problem within the civil service machine that I also think we should tackle. And look, the final questions could have, what is it that you can do to help? I do think, and there is a moral value to what biotech does above all. You can be confident in the worth of what you produce. There are delicate issues, which there's not time to reflect on dual-use technology. There are American policy wonks who take me aside and say, all this openness about synthetic biology and biological processes now is like openness about nuclear physics in the 1930s. Do you realize how dangerous some of this stuff is? And I think that one of the values of conferences like this is the more we can find also a shared understanding of the constraints and the inhibitions on what people can and cannot do. And if you find someone that you know, wherever you are in the world, doing something that you don't think is within the moral boundaries, the stronger that across the community, in all the different types of societies we're in, to constrain that, the better. And it's probably better than relying simply on regulation. But thank you so much for what you're doing, and thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Lord David Willetts, for being with us here today.